Well, it is also the second day of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, that meeting taking place in Johannesburg. You'll know the acronym, I'm sure it's AGOA. President Ramaphosa addressing the forum this morning, saying that more needs to be done to intensify the relationship between the United States and African countries. Several countries certainly benefiting from AGOA, and that South Africa's participation has definitely contributed to job creation. Dan Moyane, good afternoon to you. I'm looking after your show this afternoon. You're down at Nasrec for us today. How do we know as a country that we're contributing jobs-wise to AGOA?
Good afternoon, Gareth, and welcome here at AGOA, Nasrec in Johannesburg. I guess the only way we can know is by unpacking the numbers and then seeing what sectors of our economy are active or utilizing what the AGOA offers, which is about 20 years old now, 23 years old to be exact, since 2000, when President Bill Clinton drove the AGOA into reality. So it's a question of measurement to see what areas, what are we actually exporting to America, or what are Americans importing from our shores here in South Africa. But as you know, Gareth, AGOA is not only a South Africa-centered or South Africa-centric platform. It's an act by the American government to enable its trade relations with the continent, which over the years has seen a lot of competition, especially from the likes of China, which has grown by leaps and bounds in its activities on our continent. And many people seeing that the American lawmakers are using AGOA as that counterbalance to make sure that China does not just enjoy the biggest slice of African economic activity and production and products and goods and services. So it takes time. But I've got with me this afternoon, Gareth, Eckhard Noumann. He's a senior associate of the Trade Law Center in South Africa, but he's also an economist. He's been involved with AGOA literally since its inception. He's missed very few of its regular annual forum meetings. He's been here at Nasrec since yesterday was day one. As you correctly said, today is day two, and it will all wrap up tomorrow. Eckhard, welcome to eNCA, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here.
Yeah, first up, an overriding question. What is the Trade Law Center? Why the interest with you and AGOA since its inception?
Yeah, well, the Trade Law Center is only a little bit younger than the start of the AGOA legislation. It was founded in the early 2000s. And we are doing work in this space, not just AGOA, but on the continent, particularly on the continent. At the moment, a lot of our focus is on the African Continental Free Trade Area, previously on the economic partnership agreements between the EU and African countries. So it's in that space of trade, that nexus of trade and law, where those two topics meet. And we feel very much active in supporting the AGOA legislation from the start.
And yesterday you took part with the private sector engagements, and people have been looking at the role of the private sector in driving AGOA forward. The current term, of course, has got 2 years to go, but there's moves now to say, please, can we renew it early before 2025? What have you heard and seen in this AGOA, especially from a private sector participation yesterday?
Well, I mean, you're quite right in terms of referring to the private sector, because ultimately it's not governments that trade with each other, it's the private sector. It's SMEs, it's labour, it's employees that benefit, it's consumers on the United States import side that benefit. And AGOA has been around, as you mentioned, since 2000. It is up for renewal before its expiry. Its automatic expiry in September 2025. But leaving it to the last moment is too late. Business requires certainty, especially United States business that are importing from South Africa. These decisions to import and to source get taken well in advance of an expiry date. So it is an absolutely critical forum at the moment, the first one in person since the pandemic, and it is a particularly important time at the moment.
What was the private sector grappling with yesterday?
Well, I mean, the key issue is about an extension of the AGOA legislation. That is first and foremost on everyone's mind, and I think the signs for such an extension or renewal of the AGOA legislation are particularly good at the moment. In fact, they've never been better than what they've been in the last few days. There have been important statements and support from President Biden coming out. Senior and influential members of the Senate have written to the Senate leadership a couple of days ago, imploring this AGOA legislation to be to be streamlined and to be prioritized on the legislative calendar in the Senate. So these are two very important signs that the United States is also buying into the importance of a timely renewal.
Yeah, that tells me that also there's appetite on the African continent to renew this.
Absolutely. I think the United States has been, it came a little bit out of the blue. A US Senator, John Kennedy, has proposed legislation that would renew the AGOA legislation by 20 years. African countries until now have been fairly careful in asking for a 10-year extension. Personally, I feel there's no reason why it can't be made permanent, because these preferences benefit both sides. For every transaction, there's an import that's benefiting.
Do they really? I mean, some people have been saying, some critics of AGOA have been saying it's been underutilized. The President, Cyril Ramaphosa, today, when he officially opened it, saying that's a reality of underutilization, but most has been benefiting America, which seeks to expand its influence on the continent using the trade agreement.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the AGOA legislation is non-reciprocal. It's not a trade act. It is a unilateral, non-reciprocal offer to sub-Saharan African countries. So that needs to be borne in mind. Of course, it is not entirely unconditional. There are certain eligibility criteria, and that are being enforced, as we've just been seeing. There are 4 countries put on notice about possibly being suspended from the 1st of January. But in terms of, just to address your question on utilization, we need to bear in mind that the United States tariff schedule already allows for duty-free access for about 37% of all tariff lines. So the remainder is effectively all falling under AGOA. So the utilization could be better, but some countries have been doing really well, like Lesotho and Kenya, for example, are 2 countries, and South Africa. It might be a smaller share of the total, but certainly in terms of volumes, very, very important and very large exports under AGOA.
I saw a report the other day that said in 2021, when they looked at the numbers, less than 1%, if not 1%, of all of U.S. imports came from Africa. Therefore, that utilization or underutilization is very glaring to be seen. In this meeting here in Johannesburg, from the private sector, did you pick up suggested ways of boosting those numbers going forward?
Yeah. If one looks back at what the utilization or the share, the U.S. import market share of Africa's exports, certainly sub-Saharan Africa's exports, were in 2000 when the AGOA legislation started, and last year, that hasn't much changed. That's gone sideways. Last year, less than just short of 1% of US imports came from sub-Saharan African AGOA beneficiary countries, and a third of that was entered duty-free under AGOA. That said, most of the rest was duty-free anyway. So African countries are basically, as a result of AGOA, not paying import duties into the United States through AGOA and through the general tariff relations of the United States and the normal schedule. So yes, the numbers haven't changed that much in terms of the percentage, but also this is off a base that's been expanding. So it is certainly, there is room for improvement.
There's definitely room for improvement. What's the total number here in dollars of the trade last year between the US and Africa in terms of AGOA? How much are we talking about?
So over the last couple of years, obviously we had the pandemic that put a bit of a dampener on things. Last year, $30 billion US worth of imports came from AGOA beneficiary countries, of which just over a third was entered under AGOA preference. So that is roughly $10.5 billion US benefited from AGOA preferences.
Okay, let's bring it closer home. South Africa's share of that, and what sectors from here? I mean, I've walked around at the exhibition center, the Made in Africa exhibition center. I've seen the automotive industry is present, the textile industry is present, the food industry. Even some of our township businesses are exhibiting here. So what sectors is South Africa taking advantage of?
Yeah, well, our largest beneficiary under AGOA preference is the automotive sector, and that is just purely in terms of trade terms. So it's roughly $1.5 billion US last year. Ferrochromium is a very important one. Gold jewelry is another very important one. And let's not forget agricultural sector, citrus exports. We are the second largest importer or exporter to the United States of citrus. We are, together with, alongside Kenya, account for 80% of the US import market share of macadamia nuts. Our wine exports are doing particularly well, and the normal tariffs on wine are fairly high. So those are certainly sectors that are really benefiting from AGOA. But the automotive sector, the boat building industry is another beneficiary. It's all part of AGOA. There are very few duties still being paid by South African exporters.
Yeah, you didn't hear my colleague Gareth Edwards, who's sitting in studio in Hyde Park and standing in for me in studio there. He asked, is it contributing to jobs? Because even President Joe Biden the other day in his statement around AGOA, when he spoke about the reauthorization, he mentioned that there's been opportunity to create jobs. And in South Africa, we know that we've got a very high unemployment rate. You've mentioned the mining sector, you've mentioned the agriculture sector like citrus, you've mentioned the others. I mean, do you have an idea, do you get a sense that these sectors are actually benefiting job-wise in our country from AGOA?
Yeah. To be honest, I don't have the numbers on employment. It certainly has been a very positive impact. The Citrus Growers Association are often on record saying, it's supporting tens of thousands of jobs. The automotive sector is on record as saying it's supporting a lot of jobs. Of course, a nuanced analysis of this would say, to what extent, if it wasn't for those preferences, would that export or that trade fall away? Probably not all of it, but certainly some of it.
Okay. Now, you are an economist, but you are a senior associate of the Trade Law Center. I just want to ask, from a legal perspective, calls have been made that if you're going to extend AGOA, whether for 10 years or up to 20 years, as you said earlier, if that happens, certain provisions or aspects of it would need to be updated and changed and improved to include other industries, particularly technology and digital services, where in recent times we've seen, even in our own country, there is a growth there and more young people are getting involved with smart technologies and all of that. What would need to change, in your view, when you look at the agreement? What would need really to change? Would those things have to be specified, or the conditions as well? I mean, would the conditions, do you think Americans have to be a little bit more open-minded around conditions? Because sometimes it looks like they're telling us in Africa how to govern us, how to govern ourselves.
Yeah, look, I mean, the AGOA legislation deals only with trade in goods. Those aspects that you've mentioned, digital trade, trade in services, trade facilitation issues around customs and the thickness of the border, so to speak. These are very important issues, and I know the United States is providing a lot of support and development support. There's a Lobito corridor story we heard just the other day that between the DRC and Zambia. So there's a lot of support. It is not really part of the AGOA legislation. There are ways of improving the AGOA legislation. The most important one is providing longer time frames, because that provides businesses with certainty and predictability. So that's the most important one. In terms of the rules of origin, it is sometimes said, one could improve them. I don't think there's anything wrong with the rules of origin. But one way to improve this integration and support the continental integration agenda and the continental FTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, is to more directly link production that takes place in non-AGOA beneficiary countries to allow that to feed into the production networks and the value chains of AGOA beneficiaries. In other words, that sourcing of inputs from non-AGOA countries counts as originating content and meets those rules of origin thresholds. It's a fairly simple legislative change to that.
And that could improve intra-African trade.
Absolutely. That would bring intra-Africa into the game. If we just look at South Africa already, Botswana is not exporting anything under AGOA, but Botswana is exporting wiring looms for motor vehicles to South Africa, which find their way into the motor vehicles that head to the United States under AGOA. So there's a lot of this regional trade happening, and AGOA can play an even a greater facilitating role in encouraging these regional value chains from developing.
Yeah, we've got one day to go, and tomorrow is the third and last day of this forum, and the forum interchanges between the US and an African country. You've attended majority of them, as you told me earlier. What's different about this one compared forward? Are you very optimistic and hopeful that the way forward for AGOA will really benefit African countries, or put another way, African countries will better utilize AGOA going forward?
Look, I think I was a little bit concerned given the uncertainty around the hosting of the AGOA Forum in the lead up in recent months. South Africa has, as a host country, has done an absolutely phenomenal job. I think this AGOA Forum is of a particularly high quality. The substance being discussed is of a particularly high country. The expo is brilliant. So in that sense, and I think also the vibe from Catherine Tai and from Minister Patel and from the US Department of Commerce and so on, there's been a lot of very positive signaling that's happening. There's a lot of support for a renewal of AGOA legislation. So I think there is a lot of positive energy in there at the moment, and now is the time to harness that.
Thank you very much. Well, Gareth, that's Eckhard Naumann. He is a senior associate of the Trade Law Center. but he's also an economist. He's attended most of these AGOA forums over the years. He's seeing a difference with this one after all the concerns we saw early this year, particularly, as you would remember, around the Lady R saga in Simonstown. But that has been set aside and has been resolved. That independent probe that the president set up, clearing all those allegations of Lady R, which was alleged to have come here to pick up weapons to send to Russia and supporting Russia in that Ukraine war. So that's all gone. Now it's the way forward. So the biggest question is, what will AGOA beyond 2025 actually look like? And when will this renewal take place? But the mood here is positive. African countries have been urged to and implored to utilize AGOA properly. And of course, maybe those jobs that you asked me about, Gareth, will come in droves into the future. And later, Gareth, after 4 o'clock, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Joe Phaahla, the health minister, and Dr. Stavros of Aspen. Both of them were part of one of the breakout sessions here at AGOA today, focusing on the healthcare sector. Remember the vaccines? Africa wanting to manufacture its vaccines. Remember that big facility of Aspen down in the Cape? We'll be talking about that. What does the future look like under AGOA for African countries when it comes to the manufacturing of healthcare products like vaccines?